we want to start with body autonomy, really. And I always teach this regardless of where you're at in your child's age. The very first thing that we want them to learn is that they have a right to their body, right? So that's body autonomy. That's the foundation of boundaries and consent. And we need to teach that very, like, as the first thing, because that is an empowering concept for kids to learn and understand, right? Your body belongs to you. Only you get to say what happens to it. This is usually where parents go, but what about, if my child doesn't want to brush their teeth, or what about if they don't want to eat, These are situations where we have to just clearly define what's the non-negotiable. Parents obviously do need to have some boundaries around what's okay and not okay with their kids. And for the most part, those are kind of biological things or safety things. Like, you have to put your seatbelt on when you're in the car with me. We're going to drive somewhere, that's non-negotiable. But there are things where we can give them more choices and options so that they start to exercise their autonomy. So that can be something like, if you feel full, I'm not going to force you to eat. It's your body. But, in an hour or two, that doesn't mean you can have ice cream, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you didn't eat necessarily and there's still food on your plate, like, and you're hungry, mm-hmm. then that's the boundary there. Now, as it relates to other things like hugs, kisses, tickles, even if someone rubs your shoulder and you're not comfortable with it, you can tell them stop. You can say, please don't touch me, or I don't like that. And you have every right to do that, right? And so exercising the ability to set a boundary is so powerful for kids.
We've all been put here for a reason, and we all deserve acceptance.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.
I'm a trauma survivor from a really young age, and I have been diagnosed with complex PTSD in the past few years. I've been surrounded by death and abuse much of my life. I've been dragged through the mud and have been to the point of not wanting to go on anymore. Through my interviews with other survivors, I've learned that there is a way out. From recovering to surviving and thriving, we all have the strength to come out the other side.
You are listening to Judging Meghan.
Hi, everybody. You are listening to Judging Meghan with your host, Meghan Judge. A couple things really quickly before we start going into introducing my guests, etc. You can find me now on Patreon. My first episode is up with my husband. It's actually pretty ridiculous. I don't know if you'll think it's funny at all, but my subscribers have told me they thought it was. I also love your reviews on Apple. You can follow me on YouTube, which I'm now pushing the episodes to. So I really appreciate any reviews and subscribers. And then I'm just going to go into my quick story. So you know that I always get myself into ridiculous situations. I don't know how, but I do. And for some reason, this, I might bring Rosalia, my guest, into this because everyone I think can relate to this story. The self-checkouts at the grocery store? Do you get what this? So for some reason, I am always the idiot that cannot understand. Like, they hate me. Like, this one I love this grocery store called Lazy Acres. It's a small grocery store, like, right up the street from my house. And I can tell that the lady that's always working at the self-checkout hates my guts because I always have to push the button for help. And so I asked her the other day because I was actually self-checkout, like doing the self-checkout correctly for once, but I saw her when this woman was asking her questions and I could see her frustration. And so when she left, the lady was checking out and left, I asked her, I was like, first of all, what's your name? And I think her name was Kristen. And she goes, yeah, it's really frustrating. And I was like, well, Kristen, are you in the self-checkout because you got in trouble at work? And so they make you post at the self-checkout. She's like, She's like, you wouldn't believe the questions that I get at self-checkout. And I just thought it was the funniest thing because it's just a reminder, like, I don't know why they even have it because it takes so much more time, but in our heads,
it takes longer.
Yeah. Like, in our heads, we're like, oh, I'm not waiting in this line because we hate lines, right? Period. Americans can't deal with lines. But like the thought of a line of like
Yeah.
one person or two people ahead of you is like, oh my God, what am I going to do to make up this like extra 30 seconds in my day? I'm just going to go
Right.
to self checkout and spend an additional 5 minutes because I personally am a moron and don't understand that you can't bring like bananas and you have to weigh them. Anyways, I had to ask you if you have had any issues ever with self checkout like I have.
I used to, and I was always afraid because it was always an issue with my credit card. And yeah, like the
Yes.
same thing. You'd have to get somebody to come help you, and then you're waiting longer because they're helping someone else who's also
But also
screwed
the
up and like,
people behind
yeah,
you like hate your guts because it's like your card
yeah,
gets stuck and you don't want to put your pin in or you don't like something happens and it gets stuck and it's just it takes so much longer. It's so funny, but
yeah.
never
I
can
think it's a
somebody just
lesson in patience.
yes,
It's
100%.
it's like if you can have just patience for 30 more seconds and just go through that regular checkout instead of the self checkout. But it's like we keep doing it to ourselves. I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's like a mental thing. I think I've talked about on the podcast before how weird I find it how we all fight to get on airplanes. So it's like, oh, we're going to go
Hmm.
have a battle and push each other out of the way to go sit in a tomb that like has no
Yeah.
oxygen and like men passing gas with smelly feet for like hours and we're all like get me on the plane
Let
now.
me in.
Anyways,
Totally. Yeah.
I would like
Yeah.
to introduce Rosalia Rivera. Rosalia was actually my cousin, Medaya, sent me your information and I reached out to you because she's a big fan of yours. And when I say fan, it sounds strange, but it's like what the stuff that you're putting out into the universe is so important. I'm a parent, my cousin's a
Hmm.
parent, many of my listeners are parents, and you are a consent educator, an author, also a podcaster called the About Consent podcast. And you are now co-founder of the Brave movement, which we can also go into, which is fairly new. I wanted to welcome you to the podcast, so thank you for coming on.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I would like to kind of go into why you started and got into what you do. Obviously, my listeners know I like to start my episodes light and kind of with funny stories a lot of times, but we're going to be talking about something extremely serious and very scary, but also um, arming yourself as a parent and a human being for predators and people that we don't want to mess with in our world. So, can you tell me a little bit about what you do and what a consent educator is, number one?
Sure. Yeah, and I want to before I answer that, I just want to point out. I think most people have the language that you used about arming ourselves and predators that are out there. I think that that's usually what comes to mind when people think of sexual assault. And then if we're talking about children, it's just a whole other ball game of fear, because obviously we don't want our children to experience that kind of trauma. But the perspective that I always bring to my work is that we can empower ourselves. It's not even necessarily arming ourselves because it feels like we're on the defense, but to take it from the position of I have tapped into my power of understanding my body rights and helping my children understand their body rights and approaching the world from this really centered place of we understand what is appropriate and inappropriate, and we have the tools to speak, to use our voice, to use our power to really attract safety instead of defending ourselves from negativity, and I don't want that kind of sounds a little woo woo, which is not necessarily what I mean, but just to shift our perspective, and
Yeah.
particularly if you're a survivor, which I am. That was a really important shift for me to not live in a place of fear and hiding almost, and like keeping myself safe, but to actually stand in my power and really, you know, come from a place of power to say, I'm not allowing danger, near me because I have the ability to be safe, right? So instead of being like just having that fear of not being safe, to just know that we can be safe, right? And I think for anyone who's experienced trauma, that mind shift is really powerful, because we tend to kind of live in the past with our fear of what happened versus like being able to step into our healing and move forward in a more secure way. So I just wanted to address that because it's actually been a really new shift for me, even in my work, where I'm shifting language dramatically, and especially for parents who, I think when they imagine their children, something happening to them, they're stepping back into the fear instead of imagining how powerful their children can be in the world, knowing their rights and knowing language and understanding what they can do and the resources that they have and the advocates that they have behind them, which is such a different way of seeing our children, instead of like, oh, I hope nothing happens. So I just wanted to share that because that has been a really new shift in the last year for my work as well. And I think that's a lot of what attracts people, particularly parents and survivors, to the work I do, is I'm not coming from a fear-based place. So, but just to answer your question, so I'm a consent educator and a child sexual abuse prevention specialist. So I really specialize in abuse prevention, but it is all under the foundation of consent education because they are two separate things. And I help parents learn how to teach their kids about body safety, boundaries, and consent, but also how to communicate with the adults in their children's lives, because that's an even bigger part of the equation of body safety for their family and keeping their families safer and communities, like really dismantling the taboo around the topic of child sexual abuse, because there's still a lot of hesitance to talk about it. And my goal is to help parents really step into these conversations, whether it's, within their family, their communities, their schools, their religious institutions, like wherever it is, to dismantle the taboo. Because until we do that, this issue is going to continue being as bad as it is. Like it is a much bigger problem than most people think. So I love creating awareness and helping parents start conversations and learning how to teach their own kids about body safety and empowerment, and to prevent abuse, obviously, but also to break intergenerational cycles. And that's how I ended up starting doing this work. My sister's a survivor, and I found out when I was a teenager, when she disclosed, and she was a teenager as well. She was actually almost an adult at that point. And I realized like I wanted to do something to help survivors. I went to school for psychology and took a very long-winded turn into a bunch of different things because I was so triggered. As I was learning and taking my psychology degree, I ended up realizing I'm not ready for this yet. I didn't even know why yet, but I just wasn't ready. And when I turned 33 and I had my son, my first child, because I have 3 kids, it really started to, like life started changing and shifting towards, obviously, given my sister's history, I wanted to make sure my kids were safe and hadn't educated myself about any of it, of like how to keep them safe. And when I started to do that, when my child was going to go to a day camp for the first time, he was about four years old, I had a panic attack, and I realized like I had enrolled him and I was going to drop him off and I was feeling good about it and he was feeling great about it. And then I realized like I haven't taught my child anything yet because I kept kind of pushing it off and thinking I don't have to do that yet. Like I was always taking care of him or my mom or, and when this happened and I had this panic attack, I had the realization that I needed to learn how, right? And as I started learning, my own memories of my own abuse surfaced. And then that was, of course, very triggering. And I felt really overwhelmed and I didn't have any sort of support or guidance around like how to navigate this. But I knew I needed to keep teaching my child because I also had a second child and another on the way. And so I dove into my healing. I dove into this body safety education and realized that there's a lot of gaps. Like there's no one talking to survivor parents, and there's no one who's actually getting into the nitty gritty, because there's a lot of advice out there of like, make sure you have a safety network and teach your child the right names of their private parts. But there's no one that's really going in depth of like, if you are a survivor and this is triggering you, this is how you should approach it. And this is, here's some guidance on what to do. And just to even like acknowledge, that there's
Yeah.
survivor parents out there struggling with this.
Yeah.
So that's how consent parenting was born.
I was just going to say really quickly,
Yeah,
and I
no,
don't
that's
mean
it.
to interrupt you. Number one, I am so sorry for that's very common when abuse survivors block stuff out, and
Mm-hmm.
might have a suppressed memory. Um, and it can be very difficult. What I will say about what you said is I am extremely guilty of, and while you were speaking and sharing your story, I was like, wow, I really need to do, and I knew this before I interviewed you and I read up on you. I was like, I am not doing a good job. I have never done a good job. And that's okay. You can always, if you're listening to this day today and
Yeah.
you have a 12-year-old girl like I do, or I have an 8-year-old, to be honest with you, Rosalia, I am afraid to talk to my kids about it. Um,
Yeah.
I think
It's
that could be my
understandable.
own history. I've never really talked about this on the podcast before, but um, I, I do know that something happened to me when I was young. I don't know what. Um, and I am very like never really tapped into it. And it's something that happened, and so I'm very afraid of talking to my kids about stuff, and I'll leave it at that because I'm not really comfortable with my own story talking about this. I knew like if I had you on, I might. By the way, I always get an emotional. I'm a very emotional person, um, but I don't want my daughters to be to go through anything like I did. Put it that way. And so I think it's so important that I have you on today to talk about this stuff because like you kind of block stuff out, and then I know that there's stuff, but I'm like I have
Yeah.
2 daughters, and I know during COVID so much of this is coming to the surface, right? And it's good and bad, right? Because there's a lot of bad things
Yeah.
going on in the world right now. When you go to the airport and you see signs on the door that say, if somebody's with you, like let somebody know, and they take a picture. Or if you go to Disneyland, they'll take a picture of the parent and the child. Well, there's a reason for that because there's stuff going on, and if we put our head in the
Yeah.
sand and we don't really like talk to people like you and educate our children, the cycle will continue. And it's really fear based.
Right.
So I appreciate everything you're saying, but I have to admit and raise my hand and tell you I'm a parent that has not done a just job. So I have to admit
And
that.
that's okay. Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, join the club of millions, right?
Yeah.
There's so many parents that are not they because they don't know how. And that's the bigger issue is that because we're not having these conversations in the open, there is lack of awareness to the tools that are now available. And that so I'm super grateful that you have me on today, to talk about this and create that awareness, because there's so many parents. And by the way, it is never too late. Your child could be 16 and you can still be teaching this, right? So it is never, ever, ever too late. So, I just want to encourage all the parents listening who might feel the same as you. And it's like, I didn't start. That's okay. One of the ways, and I was just having a consultation with a parent earlier, and I said, their child is 7 and they're like, we didn't talk about this stuff, and there's a situation that's happened with this other child, and like we don't know what. And I said, look, all you have to do to break into these conversations is tell your child, hey, I didn't grow up with this information and I wasn't taught any of this, and I'm just learning about it now, and I'm so excited that I now have this information and these tools that I can share with you to help you stay safer. And here's, what we're going to do. And then you kind of map out like, I'm getting some books, we're going to watch some videos, we're going to have some talks. And, I'm here to be an open book. So if you have any questions at all, you know that you can come to me. I'm a safe space. Like there's no question that's off the table, right? And especially the older your child gets, because they may be hearing stuff at school that they're not sure if they can approach you with, right? And So when we open that door and we keep those lines of communications open, that can be a game changer. It can let your child know that you are safe to talk to about these issues, about these questions, about the curiosities that they have, about what they're hearing, either in school or in the media or in songs. There's so much influence that they are being exposed to. And so it's important that we just say, like, I didn't know this before, and so we're going to learn this together in a way. And if I don't know something, I'll find out for you, but like, I'm here for you, and so wherever you are in your journey, like, you can just start now and not feel guilty about it, not shame yourself, because that doesn't help, right? That doesn't make anybody feel good. And what we're doing is now saying, this is the future, like, we're here. I'm not going to like focus on what I didn't do. I'm going to focus on what I can do now.
Yeah, and I
So
love
I
hearing
hope you
that
take that.
because I panic. Like, if I know, I'm very wary. I don't let my kids have sleepovers. I'm very wary of trusting other people. When you say the things you said in the beginning, I'm like, well, that's me. I'm very scared of things that I think most people wouldn't be, or dropping them off, or like that kind of stuff. So I'm like, well, that makes sense, maybe with a history there. But what I find that I need to correct is, in our family, we don't talk about private parts. We have a name for it. It's, it's a botsy. Like, that's what my mom called it. That's what we call it. And they've learned that from a really young age, maybe because we're uncomfortable about it or whatever it is. But I want to know, like, if I were starting, like, now, like, what are some of the changes I could do, even with my 12-year-old? I have had the conversation about, we've done the basics. Nobody's allowed to touch you. Like, pretty much that's it. Like, tell us if something happens. So it's very junior varsity.
Yeah.
Tell me what are some
Right.
things that
Okay.
what I selfishly could do as a parent, because I'm more so that person that's like, you can't, like, if I drop them off at their grandparents' house, I will have a nervous breakdown one day because my husband was like, oh, they're going across the street to the neighbor's house. Well, I don't know those neighbors. No, they can't go. And I start to like freak out. So I want to know, as a parent like me, like, what are some of the things I can do now? And what are some of the things for my listeners that they can talk about that we should be doing?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I think a lot of parents, it's funny because I think parents are on like opposite ends of the spectrum, and very few are kind of grounded in the middle. And the parents who are survivors tend to have a lot of fear, obviously, and understandably, that something could happen. And so it becomes like, can I trust anyone? Is this safe? Is this safe? You're constantly sort of on the alert. And the truth is that, unfortunately, we do need to do that. And parents who are on the other end of the spectrum and they're like, just drop their kids off, or like, everything's kind of okay. Like, oh, when I grew up, like, nothing happened, and so therefore nothing's going to happen to my child. So that's the other end, which is also not safe, right? So both ends of that spectrum can actually cause issues, and we have to try to find that middle ground, right? And part of the problem is that today, because of the easy access to online porn, and because every kid has a device, younger and younger, and they don't always have supervision on those devices, right? And they can use them, or even if they don't have a device, but their friend does, and they're bringing it to school, and they might show your child something, right? We want to make sure that we are having as many age appropriate conversations with them about the different topics. So the thing is that it isn't just a few things that we have to be doing. These are ongoing conversations throughout our children's lives. So whether they are 2 or 12 or 18, we can have different conversations at different times. At your stage where you're at, and based on what you've shared, which is like, you just taught them, like, don't let anybody touch you there. We want to start with body autonomy, really. And I always teach this regardless of where you're at in your child's age. The very first thing that we want them to learn is that they have a right to their body, right? So that's body autonomy. That's the foundation of boundaries and consent. And we need to teach that as the first thing, because that is an empowering concept for kids to learn and understand, right? Your body belongs to you. Only you get to say what happens to it. This is usually where parents go, but what about, if my child doesn't want to brush their teeth, or what about if they don't want to eat, These are situations where we have to just clearly define what's the non-negotiable. Parents obviously do need to have some boundaries around what's okay and not okay with their kids. And for the most part, those are kind of biological things or safety things. Like, you have to put your seatbelt on when you're in the car with me. We're going to drive somewhere, that's non-negotiable. But there are things where we can give them more choices and options so that they start to exercise their autonomy. So that can be something like, if you feel full, I'm not going to force you to eat. It's your body. But, in an hour or two, that doesn't mean you can have ice cream, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you didn't eat necessarily and there's still food on your plate, like, and you're hungry, mm-hmm. then that's the boundary there. Now, as it relates to other things like hugs, kisses, tickles, even if someone rubs your shoulder and you're not comfortable with it, you can tell them stop. You can say, please don't touch me, or I don't like that. And you have every right to do that, right? And so exercising the ability to set a boundary is so powerful for kids, because very few actually get the ability to do that, especially if they were like, I was raised by a very strict parent. And my mother is also a survivor. I have permission to share her story, but it explains why she was so strict with me, which made me end up rebelling when I was a teenager, because we didn't have that communication of like, I was told, don't let anyone touch you. Like the thing between your legs, like I wasn't taught the word, the correct terminology until I learned it myself when I was older. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of mystery around these things. And so what I recommend is like starting with that foundation of body autonomy. Like, I had no idea that my body belonged to me. As a child, I thought I had to do everything that my parents told me. And, if I didn't, there were going to be consequences, right? And so we want kids to know, listen, I respect your autonomy. Yes, there are some rules that we need to follow. Yes, there are some exceptions when it comes to health and safety. But other than that, like, I want you to practice setting boundaries. If you don't want a hug from somebody, you're allowed to say so. Let's practice some different ways that you can say
Let me
that.
stop you right there. What did they say? Because I know that, like, I am, and as an adult, afraid. Like, I was in a work situation once where a man started massaging my shoulders when I was like at a work meeting, and I was at that period away from my 6-month-old baby, and I was like too afraid to say, get off me. It was very scary. And so I was an adult in that situation. For a kid, it must be like massively scary for this kid to be like, don't touch me, get off me. I'm going to get in trouble.
Well, it takes practice though.
So what do you tell kids
it takes practice. There's a variety of things, and we want kids to practice coming up with those things themselves first. Okay. And then we can give them some support and guidance, right? Because we want them to critically think, what would I say in that situation? And it also depends on their personality, right? Some kids are really like, they can easily set boundaries, and other kids, even if they know they can set boundaries, are shy to set them, right? So we want to give them lots of opportunity to practice. And it's not something that they're going to do from one day to the next. This is why we want them to, first of all, know that from us, so that we give them lots of opportunity to say no to things. We want to give them as many opportunities to say, no, I don't like that, or no, I don't want to do that. And, talking to the other adults in our kids' lives about it as well, so that they get on board with this practice, and helping them to understand why. It's like, I want to help my child practice boundary setting. And by the way, as an adult, if you're a survivor and of any kind of trauma for that matter, and you feel like you have poor boundaries, this might be a little bit more challenging for you, but you're also going to grow through this work, which is so beautiful, because it's going to be so healing for you to say, you know what, I didn't know how to set boundaries. I'm doing this work with you. So let's practice together. Let's role play. Like, what if your friend, was, in the playground and then they did this? How would you respond, right? So even just talking about it, putting them in that situation to think, you have a right to say stop. And if that person doesn't stop, you have a right to physically move them away from you. And if they don't, then you get help. And if someone doesn't help you, you call me, right? So giving them some exit strategies, giving them some backup plans, to say like, my mom is always on my side. She's always going to be my advocate. She's going to stand up for me, and she's going to acknowledge and recognize that because I have a right to my boundaries, that there's never a situation where that's going to be my fault, where somebody did something to me and they would make me feel like it's my fault, because my family, my parents have taught me that they're going to back me up, and they believe me, and they support me, and they support my body rights. So it's an ongoing conversation, and I think when we start with these conversations, if you feel like you're not really sure how to, talk about it because it wasn't something you were raised with, there are so many wonderful books available. One book for you, for your child's age, I would say, is a book called Consent for Kids by Rachel Bryan. I love that book. It's such a great book. It's in almost like a comic book format, and there's like all of these different little scenarios that this kid kind of finds himself in and how they respond, and it gives you so much language, but it's also like a cool, fun book. It's not sort of this like stuffy, old-fashioned kind of book. It's a really fun book for kids, especially if they can read it themselves. Like, they're going to get into it, So that's a really great book too, because they can read that book, and maybe they'll be like, oh, check out this particular situation, and it gives them ideas of language that they can use and how this character responded. Kids love stories, right? So stories help them to step into that situation that the character is in and imagine what they would do. So there's so many tools today. There's books, there's videos. Amaze.org is another great content platform that has videos that talk about these topics. So if you feel like there's a topic that really triggers you and you're not sure that you can get through the conversation without like breaking down, you can watch a video together, right? And just like process it and then have a conversation about it after. So it's not all the pressure is on you to come up with every single thing that you have to teach, right? There's guidance and there's tools out there, so you don't have to be stressed about it.
I think what you're saying is such great information, but something you said is getting like family on board. So say you want to have a conversation and there's like a mother-in-law, for example, or aunt that is uncomfortable talking about this stuff. How do you get family to get on board and teach them that they have to be on board? That must be an obstacle that you must run into often.
Oh, yes. Well, here's the thing. We live in a rape culture.
Yes.
Like, this is what we are being fed all the time, right? And so the natural sort of response is that it's a scary topic, or this is making me uncomfortable. So I don't know if we need to talk about it? It's sort of this resistance can come up. It doesn't always. And so I want to remind parents, sometimes you'll get somebody who really understands what you're talking about because you've presented it in the right way. And so what I always recommend to parents is that we want to approach it in the same way that it was approached to you, which is that you're learning about it, right? This isn't information that you've had all your life or that you grew up with. So if you're new to it, they're likely going to be new to it as well. And they don't have all the information that you have. So we want to start from this place of compassion to say, okay, this person is a blank screen. They don't know anything. So I want to inform them about my why first, before I make the request of what I need them to do and how I need them to do it. So we're going to start with the why. So what does that look like? Well, most people don't know that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys in the United States will be abused before the age of 18. And these are conservative numbers because 60% of children who are abused don't report when they're children. So these numbers are statistically much higher. But most people don't know that statistic, right? And it's different in different parts of the world. But in the US, it's 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. That's a high percentage. That means in a classroom of 20 kids, there's potentially 4 or more children in there, right, that are potentially being abused. And again, these are conservative numbers. So what does that mean? That means that there is a higher chance that, we don't want our children to be one of those statistics. And when we start educating people about this information, another statistic that a lot of people don't know is that 90% of abuse happens by people that a child in the family knows and trusts. It's not stranger danger, right? This is a myth that many generations were taught, which is incorrect. It's people that you know. And the breakdown of that is that 30% is family, 40% are other youth, and then the other 20% is, teachers, coaches, religious authorities, like that's, neighbors. That's the other sort of 20%. So the larger percent is family and then youth. Most people don't know that, right? So if you start with, hey, I just learned this really interesting information about these statistics that I didn't know. And as I'm, wanting to make sure that my child can be safe in the world, I'm learning about body safety education, and I just learned this really interesting information. I'm sharing it with you because since now we're starting to teach our child about body safety, I want to raise awareness for those who are, in my child's life, because I want them to know what we're practicing, how we're interacting with them, that we're teaching them about boundaries, that we're teaching them that people have to ask first before they just, go in for a kiss, and that my child gets to say yes or no to that, and that it's okay. And, so this is what we're practicing. I wanted to let you know about it because we learned this information, all of these statistics. And then typically, people will say, well, that's really interesting, but do I really need to ask for a hug or a kiss? Like, I'm not a predator. And then you can say, well, actually, by doing that, you're helping them learn how to practice setting boundaries. You're helping them learn to acknowledge that they have body rights. And when we help them practice in low stake settings, then they have a better chance of using their voice and knowing what to do in a high stake situation. And hopefully they'll never be in a high stake situation. But if they are, you've helped us practice that. You've helped my child develop their voice, right? And so when we put it into that context to say, you're not the enemy and I'm not pointing a finger at you, and I know this seems really different and you didn't grow up with this and maybe you didn't know this information, but this is why we're doing what we're doing. And then ultimately, if that person has, still pushes back, well, then you have to determine if you're going to set stronger boundaries with that person, or, you're going to have to just keep reminding them about your boundaries, or you're going to have to ultimately cut that person out of your child's life because they are not being supportive on something that is really important. If that person is someone who is very touchy-feely or is like always tickling your child or is like, you're seeing signs of grooming that are making you uncomfortable, and it's someone that, is sort of like a highly respected person in your family, it's going to cause some friction. And, it's something that we just have to prepare ourselves for and be okay with, because ultimately our child is our priority, right? And that's the relationship that we want to prioritize.
I love what you said about, and as you're saying this, I'm thinking of a guest that I had on, and that statistic is terrifying to me, by the way, 1 in 4. It's common for kids to either have suppressed memories or in some cases my next question is getting into the grooming process, is I had a guest on that's grandfather groomed him. Okay. So he was obsessed with his grandfather. Everything had to do with his grandfather. His grandfather would take him to bars and he was fantastic and he idolized him and he would give him like things that he wasn't supposed to have, like the whole grooming process. Right. But he didn't come out with his story. I think he's in his like late 20s now, maybe mid 20s. And it wasn't until COVID, I think, that he had the courage to come out and say, this is what happened. He was caught, the grandfather was caught molesting him, and then they never saw the grandfather again, basically. So when you talk about this, the people around you or adults, or if you have, like, for example, like a nanny or an aunt or an uncle that are constantly around and they don't want to get on board, I think that what I suffer from, and I'm sure a lot of people suffer from, is trying to be too polite. Right? Trying to be too polite and being scared to say, well, this is my role. This is what we do. But they don't want to be like, no, this is like what we're going to talk about. So I find all of that really striking. Yeah. And I think that as a culture, that must be very common, that people don't want to say, well, you just can't be around, or whatever it
Yeah.
is. Am I right on that?
Yeah. Absolutely. 100% you are. And, especially when you're up against culture itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like if your ethnic culture is very physical and very huggy kissy and you're like, I need some rules and boundaries around that, you're going to be looked at like, what do you like, who are you?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you come from? Like, are you part of our culture? And it takes a lot of courage. It really does. And so there's a couple of things, right? And I talk about this, especially as the holidays, come up. This is really challenging for a lot of people when they're like, I don't want to like be in the same room with this person because they're constantly crossing boundaries. And hopefully I just have to deal with it for a few hours, right? And then I move on, right? But the truth is that it is hard when we're pushing up against this culture. And so some of the recommendations that I do is I tell parents, practice boundary setting. So like practice that line that you want to say, that you wish you could say, but have never had the guts to say yet because you're not sure how it's going to land. You're afraid of severing that relationship or what, you have to kind of do some journaling on this. And I would recommend, ask yourself, like, if this person pushes back, what do I want to say? Like, first of all, what's the boundary that I want to set? Write it down and practice saying it. Practice it with your partner, with your friend, in the mirror. Like, practice saying it over and over and over until you feel like it's become second nature, right? And you're visualizing in your mind saying it to this person so that in your mind it's become so real that you feel like, okay, when I am in this situation, hopefully I'll be able to say this, but you want to have practiced it as much as possible. So that's one aspect. And this is something that you can also do with your child together so that they learn how to say, I would rather a high five, or if they want the hug, fantastic, go in for the hug. But if you don't want the hug, here's something that you can say. You can say no thanks, or you can say, how about a high five instead, or like whatever it is, right? So when you're practicing that with your child, you can also do the same for yourself. So let's say that you're in a situation where grandma comes over for Thanksgiving and, you've told her like, hey, this is what we're practicing. Please ask for the hug. She comes in and she gives the hug, or she asks for the hug. So you're like, right on, she's asking for the hug. She did it. And your child says, no, I'm not really, thanks, grandma, but not today. And she starts acting sad, right? And she's like now gone into guilt mode, like trying to guilt your child. Oh, I'm so sad that you didn't give me a hug. And you're like, well, that's not really respecting the answer, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you're still kind of pushing the boundary here. So like, what do I do? If you know that grandma has the potential to do that, you want to practice ahead of time and say, what would I want to say to grandma if she does that, right? And you could step in and say, well, grandma, actually, we don't want to guilt anybody into a kiss, like, or a hug. How about, maybe a hug later if, Johnny's up to it. And, being kind of gentle but firm about it, right? And having practiced that ahead is going to give you the confidence to say it, and even if you fumble and you're like, well, here's why we don't want to guilt a child, and kind of having some of that information ahead. So if we practice it ahead of time, that can be really helpful. But also, let's say that they push back in that situation, right? And you can say, well, grandma, I understand that you wish that you had a hug, and we can discuss this after if you'd like, but Johnny said no thanks. So let's move on and we can, come back to this later. So you can, diffuse it. And there's lots of different ways that we can practice setting boundaries. Like we use I statements, right? So that the situation is like, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't want to have this conversation. And you're setting that boundary. And it's not about you keep doing this or you keep asking or, so there. And one of the books that I recommend also, because parents need to practice boundary setting just as much as kids sometimes. But there's a really great book by Nedra Tawwab. And I think it's called Setting Boundaries, Finding Peace, which is a fantastic book for anyone who feels like they need to get better about their own boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
to help you learn how to have that language, because ultimately you have to be that advocate for your child. And that is actually the bigger work of consent education. Because when we're starting to teach our kids, we can't expect them to be experts at setting boundaries right away. And we can't expect them to prevent abuse, right? That's our job, is to do whatever we can to reduce the risks and limit the opportunities. So, as an example, if we see someone who is displaying very obvious grooming signs and you also have a gut feeling about it, and you want to stop whatever that interaction is, like maybe that person's tickling your child looks like they're not enjoying it, but they don't know how to say stop yet, you have to step in and say, it doesn't seem like Johnny's having a good time, and I don't think you asked him if you could tickle him. So can you please stop? Because it doesn't look like he's enjoying that.
Well, something I want to say is, what if like people already think you're a little bit of a bitch? Just maybe putting myself in these shoes. And
so let me ask you this though.
Yeah.
What though?
I don't know, because I'm just telling you, because I'm having all these flashbacks of the years that this is from me, I think, in my own past. And I'm like, whatever. I don't like when people hug my kids too much. I don't like it. It makes me really uncomfortable. It's a cultural thing. I get that. I'm Irish and Italian, and the Italian culture, lots of hugging, lots of touching. My husband is Irish and Mexican, and Italian, so very like lots of hugging, lots of picking up, lots of touching, passing around my kids to friends, and I have always freaked out since they were babies. And again, this is just me. I know that I'm probably an extreme example, but I also, what you're saying is, if I were to say, teach them like we're talking about, I think I would be scared to say, we're just working on this and we're working on consent. Could I say something like that? I'm just throwing myself out as an example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we don't have to give people full explanations.
Yeah.
You know, it's when I say talking to them about the why, this is the people that we really care about having them in our kids' lives, right?
Yeah.
We actually want them to continue being in our kids' lives.
Yeah.
But if it's someone who's like a distant cousin, you only see them once a year, you don't need to explain all of it, but you can still set boundaries and not have to explain why. You know, you can just say, this is what we're practicing, we're teaching consent. And that means that, my kids get to say what they're okay with and not okay with.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that. And, ultimately, I think one of the things that I come across a lot are parents who, they're afraid to talk to the principal at school to ask them, like, what are your policies, around abuse prevention? Because they don't want to be seen as that parent. But here's the question, the bigger question.
Mm-hmm.
So what? So what if they see you that way? That just is this fear of not being received, right? Like of not being maybe liked, or like this. A lot of times it's an irrational fear because of whatever we've experienced in our life. But a lot of times we have to go, so what? My child's safety trumps all of that, right? My child's safety trumps my discomfort to have this conversation, because maybe having this conversation is going to make my child's school safer, which means my child will be safer going to that school.
Well,
so we have to look at the long term of
That's a great point, though, because I mean, I know I've never had that conversation. My kids go to Catholic school. We just take for granted that they drop them off at school. I love their school. It's an excellent place. Like, we're happy. But it is true, because you don't want, I hate to try and be funny, but you don't want to be the Karen going into the office, going, well, what are you doing about blah, blah, blah. But I think it's a good point. So if you were a parent going to a school, what's something you could say?
Well, you just want to know, what is their policy around abuse prevention? So are they, do the staff have regular trainings? Are the, teachers getting regularly educated about body safety and abuse prevention? They are mandated reporters, so they do need to know, like, what are the signs to look for if I do see a child that is, exhibiting signs of abuse, that they are mandated to report that. And one of the reasons why that's even important, again, we want to look at the statistic of 40% of offenders are youth, right? So if there is a child that is being abused, there is a higher chance that that child is going to reenact that behavior with another youth, right? And because depending on the child's age, you may have really young children who are being abused. They don't recognize that it's abuse, and they may be perpetuating this with other children in the form of a game, right? Because a lot of times predators, particularly with young children, will introduce abuse through games. So it's like, oh, this
Like
is supposed to be fun, and we're
doctor,
just playing a game,
like playing
like
doctor or
doctor,
something
like
like that.
tickling,
Yeah.
like, yeah, there's lots of different grooming manipulations, right? And so if that child is not being educated, so if that school isn't teaching body safety, and obviously that parent or that family member, whoever is doing the abuse, if that child doesn't know that it's wrong, then that abuse is going to continue, which is one of the reasons why I advocate for schools to have some kind of mandatory body safety education. And so that's another question that you can ask at your school. Are you teaching any kind of body safety curriculum? Because that's also going to reduce the risk of a child in that classroom from being, from experiencing abuse, or if they are experiencing abuse, from that abuse continuing, because maybe that child didn't know it was inappropriate. They can now report it, and it reduces the risk of that child perpetuating that abuse.
Yeah.
Right. And also, of course, getting the help that they need to stop the abuse so that they are safe. So, asking questions like, are you teaching this? Is it something that's even top of mind? And unfortunately, a lot of schools are like, well, we don't have that problem, or we've never thought about it because it's never come up. But the only reason it's never come up is because maybe your students aren't aware that it's an issue, because, they're being abused at home, and it's been normalized, right? Unfortunately, a lot of kids don't recognize it because adults tend to think it's going to be a very violent situation. But as you know, and as you talked about with that guest, this person adored their grandfather, right? Who was the one who was abusing them. And a lot of times it isn't until the abuse becomes much more physical, or, and it's escalated already, that a child recognizes, and then they don't know what to do, or that person has, threatened them or manipulated them into not telling. So having a school be able to teach this information in an age-appropriate, safe way can be very helpful. And it also lets you know that the school is being proactive. So schools, can play a really big role in supporting abuse prevention education. And these are questions that we can be asking. A lot of parents, so I don't want to be seen as that parent. So I say, well, why don't you get together with a group so that you can all be that parent, right? So
I
go to your PTA
I have a
meeting.
great group of moms. Like, we go to this field pickup after school in like an hour, and I'm going to be like, listen, ladies, this is what we're doing. Because
That's awesome.
Because I know that people will care about this. And it's true. It's not really something you think of. I mean, it's always in the back of your mind as a parent, like, and all my listeners that are listening. But, I grew up Catholic. I have Catholic guilt. My mom gave me a book called Where Babies Are Made, or How Babies Are Made, something like that, and it was puppies. And
my husband had that one too.
And my mom gave it to me when I was like 13 and already knew about everything. And it was a cartoon book. I love my mom, but maybe not the best at explaining that stuff. But I do think it's stuff that we just, as parents, like, really need to think about and educate. I needed to ask you, for the sake of time, something I am terrified of is TikTok. Even though I'm on TikTok, because as creators and podcasters, we have to be on social media. But for my 12-year-old, especially, internet safety is terrifying to me. I had a guest on that talked about, sexual predators, and she was sold, like she was in being sold in the black market, or whatever it's called, this like sex trade,
the dark web,
as a young girl. Can you touch on internet safety and like how, as parents, we can kind of be aware and get involved that way?
Yeah, I mean, so internet safety, I'll say the internet is it's like the Wild West still.
Yeah.
Like how many years later after, we just need to, first of all, there's a couple of things that I will say about internet safety, because there's different elements of it, right? There's the social media space, there's the gaming space, there's just even search engines and like accidentally coming across a porn site, which happened to my 9-year-old. So I've had the realization that even myself, who am an educator of this, my child still accidentally stumbled upon it. But we had fortunately had the conversation ahead of time of like, what do you do if you accidentally stumble upon adult content that's not meant for kids?
Yeah.
So we've had that conversation, and fortunately in time that when it happened, he was able to tell me. And he didn't tell me until 2 weeks later. He sat with this knowledge of like, oh my God, I saw this weird thing. I don't know what it was. Didn't make sense.
Yeah.
I shut it down like you told me, but the image stuck in my mind and like, I can't make sense of it. And it's weird and it's kind of freaking me out. And like, so I'm telling you now.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I'm glad that you told me. I wish you told me right away, but I'm glad that you told me.
He was probably scared.
And so,
yeah.
And so, well, and he knew that he wasn't going to get in trouble, but I think he was just like, I know I saw something I shouldn't have seen, and it wasn't on purpose, but it happened. And so I always say to parents, like, it's at this point not a matter of if something would happen, it's a matter of when something would happen. And so this is why we really do need to talk to our kids about online education, safety education, ongoing. Like, this isn't just, here, let's read some books or watch some videos. I mean, just like everything else that I'm talking about, these have to be ongoing conversations, because the internet is constantly evolving. Like now with VR, which is a whole other, I really recommend that parents don't introduce VR.
What is VR?
Because there's such, virtual reality, those.
We have one of those. Great. An Oculus.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
the Oculus. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
just be really cautious.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. You can talk to your kids about it though,
okay.
right? So even if you do, like, whoever's listening and they're like, oh my God, I did this already. It's okay. You just need to talk to your kids about the fact that there are these things that are happening out there, and let them know that it is, even if they've made a mistake and, maybe something, they've already seen something, or they've accidentally chatted with somebody, or somebody sent them something, that it's still okay for them to talk to you, because they're not going to get in trouble. The biggest thing that kids fear is that you're going to take the device away, right? So one of the first things that I recommend, like, if your child made a mistake and then they said, well, if I tell my mom that, I went into a chat room with someone, even though they told me not to, and then something happened, I can't tell my mom because she's going to get mad and then she's going to take my device away, right? If they have that fear, then they're less likely to talk to you about it. So one of the first things I recommend is having a safety, an online safety agreement or a tech agreement. There are lots of free versions of this. You can find one, I think, through commonsensemedia.org, for example. And that they have a template of a media agreement. And so essentially it is a list of rules that you both agree to follow. So these aren't just rules for the child, but also for the parent, because we also have to model good digital behavior, right? So some of that might be like not oversharing about our kids online, and asking your child not to share private information about themselves online, right? So you can customize this template however you want. And it'll have some starters of like, here's some basics that you should both agree to. One of them being, for example, using your device in a common space, or having a time that, the device is no longer in the bedroom after a certain time, right? So there have to be some parameters, some boundaries that you both agree to, and that if they cross those parameters or go off, and do something they're not supposed to, that you have a regular check-in with them, that you're, having open conversations. There's so much information also, again, amaze.org and some other, I have some different links. I'm trying to think of some other videos, but there's lots of videos for older kids, especially, that talk about this now, because we're seeing the explosion. There's just been an explosion of online predators that are trying to get access to kids, right? And unfortunately, there's so many ways that they do it that we can't cover them all, but there are resources out there that help us cover that, right? Because we can't think of everything as parents, of
No.
like all the different ways in which it's happening, but there's so many resources, including lots of videos that you can watch with your kids, or your kids can watch on their own with their friends, that help them learn about online safety and navigate what to do. Even, helplines, like if they don't feel like they can come to a parent because whatever the reason, there are resources out there that can help guide them as to like, here's what you do if you've come across this situation. A lot of times they do guide kids back to their parents, or to say like, here's someone that you can talk to, and they'll connect the parent. But there's lots of resources if you already have had a situation, but then also how to prevent the situation in the first place.
Okay,
So
well, I messed
there's
up
lots of support.
again and did this incorrectly. I'm going to say that because we caught our daughter doing a Snapchat, and we said, you're not allowed to have Snapchat. And then she created one, and then we took her phone away, and we were terrified. And then we gave it back. But now I'm sitting here listening to her, and I'm going, oh no, like now she's probably too afraid to talk to us about stuff. So I appreciate everything you're saying, but if you found yourself in my place where I messed up, is there a way to fix this?
Absolutely. There's
Yeah.
always a way to fix it.
Okay.
The way to fix it is really just being honest, right? Hey, I thought that this was okay, but I realize now actually that this is not okay, and here's why.
Mhm.
And so let's go back to the drawing board, and let's start fresh with an agreement that we both agree to these rules, and we're open about it. And I know that you really value your connection to your friends, and you really value your connection online. It's of course it's an interesting world. There's so much on the internet that is great. There's also a lot on the internet that's not, right? There's also a lot that's not safe. And so my job is really to make sure you're safe. I want you to learn how to navigate the internet safely. It's the same as driving. When you get a driver's license, you're going to need to go to school to learn how to drive properly. You're going to need to learn the rules of the road. You're going to, need me to help you learn how to drive a car, right? So all of these things are kind of the same. I can't just let you go willy-nilly and like, I thought that it was okay, but I realize now that it's not. So let's start from ground zero and, start fresh. Here's, some rules that I think are going to be helpful for you being safe and for me being, looped into what's happening. And as long as you can be honest and open with me, no matter what it is, even if you think that you're going to get in trouble, likely that you're not, we're just going to figure out how to get out of the situation that you got into, right? My job isn't to punish you. My job is to help you learn how to navigate things safely. So if you come from that place of honesty and transparency and connection, connection over correction, I always say,
I love
is
that.
going to be more powerful, a lot more powerful.
Yeah. For the sake, I literally, when I say this, I could trap you for 3 hours and you would be like, get me out of here. This crazy lady is driving me insane. Why did I agree to do this podcast? But I
love it.
Learned so much in this hour. Thank you so much. Where can my listeners find you? Like, I know that you have multiple social media accounts for different things. Do you mind just sharing a few and like the best way if somebody wants to contact you? Also, I wanted to know, do you ever speak to schools?
I do speak to schools.
Okay.
I train educators and parents, but not kids directly.
Okay.
But I can recommend educators for school curriculums. But yeah, I love talking to schools, and I love talking to parents and PTA groups. Like, it's one of my favorite things, because then they can get together and talk to the school about implementing policies. But yeah, so my website is consentparenting.com, and I have tons of free resources there as well. But you can also connect with me through Instagram or Facebook, and both of those handles are Consent Parenting. I'm on Twitter very little.
Me too.
But I'm on there sometimes. Yeah, it's a whole other ballgame. But and you can also find me on LinkedIn. So a lot of people, if they're looking to connect me to their school, the school usually connects with me through LinkedIn. And that's just Rosalia Rivera is my handle there. But otherwise, it's Consent Parenting on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm pretty active there. So,
well, I am so grateful. I'm grateful to my cousin, number one. Shout out, Dia. I love you. I'm I've learned so much in this hour. I have a lot of work to do, which, you know, I think is good to always be self-aware as parents, to know that our job is always evolving and learning and doing the best we can. And, you know, I love my kids more than I can ever explain to someone. I know that you do too, and we all do as parents. But we just want to keep them safe, you know, and protect them and do the best job we can. So I really appreciate you coming on. I know my listeners are going to really appreciate this episode as well. Everyone, thank you for listening. If you want to reach out to me, you know, my Instagram is @judgingmegan. I love hearing from you all. I love your comments. I only like nice comments. So if you're going to say anything mean, you can reach out to Rosalia Rivera. I'm just joking. But in all honesty, this was really a great episode. I learned so much. So thank you again. In closing, be happy by making other people happy. Thank you, Rosalia.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.